A rough hand seized Isaiah Reed's stirrup leather before his horse could move. Leather creaked hard beneath the grip, stopping soldier and horse together. Isaiah looked down at Thomas Hale standing in the dust. The rancher's fingers trembled against the blue cavalry coat. Thomas Hale pressed a tarnished buffalo badge into Isaiah Reed's palm. The metal felt cold. Cold as the winter when Isaiah rode away from this town. Thomas Hale swallowed once, voice scraping dry as prairie wind. "You swore an oath here, buffalo soldier." Dust rolled slow across the empty street as Isaiah Reed rode into town. Hoofbeats struck the hard ground in a steady rhythm. Thud. Pause. Thud again. Most towns greeted strangers with noise. A hammer on iron. A wagon wheel rattling past. Someone calling from a porch. This place offered nothing but wind dragging along the boards of quiet buildings. Isaiah Reed kept his eyes forward. The blue cavalry coat across his shoulders had faded to the color of old sky. Brass buttons dulled by years of rain and dust. A buffalo soldier rode where he pleased. But even a soldier could feel when a town held its breath. His horse slowed near the far end of the street. A ranch gate leaned crooked beside a narrow road cutting into open pasture. Wood creaked in the wind. The hinges rasped like tired bones. Isaiah touched the reins, ready to ride past. A hand seized the stirrup leather. Hard. Sudden. The horse stamped once, iron shoe striking rock with a sharp crack. Isaiah looked down. Thomas Hale stood there in the dust. Age had bent the rancher's shoulders but not the grip in his hand. His fingers held the leather strap like a man clinging to the last plank of a broken ship. Wind pushed against his coat. The ranch gate behind him groaned again. "Isaiah Reed," Thomas Hale said quietly. The name carried no anger. Only weight. Isaiah said nothing. His hand rested near the saddle horn. Thomas Hale slowly opened his palm. Metal tapped against Isaiah's boot. A dull sound. Click. A cavalry badge rested in the rancher's shaking hand. Buffalo head stamped deep in worn brass. Isaiah felt the old years push against his chest like cold water. He had not seen that badge since another winter. Another place. Another promise made beside a dying fire. Thomas Hale lifted his eyes. "You swore an oath here," he said. The wind dragged across the pasture grass. Dry blades whispered together. Isaiah Reed breathed once through his nose. Slow. The kind of breath a soldier takes before stepping back into trouble. His boot slid from the stirrup. Leather creaked as he dropped to the ground. The horse snorted softly behind him. Thomas Hale stepped back from the gate. The ranch house stood a short distance away. Paint peeling. One shutter hanging loose, tapping the wall in a slow wooden knock. Knock. Pause. Knock again. Isaiah walked toward the porch. Each board answered under his weight. Creak. Creak. The door opened before he could knock. A young widow stood there in the fading light. Mary Hale. Her hands gripped the edge of the door like it was the last solid thing left in the world. Her eyes moved from her father to the buffalo soldier standing beside him. And for the first time since riding into town, Isaiah Reed felt the full shape of the trouble waiting inside that house. The door hinges gave a tired whine as Mary Hale opened it wider. Warm light spilled across the porch boards. Lantern glow. Yellow and steady. Isaiah Reed stood there with dust on his coat and the cold still clinging to him. Mary steadied him for a long moment. Her voice came quiet. "You'd better come in before the wind steals the heat." The words carried no welcome. Only sense. Isaiah stepped across the threshold. The floorboards spoke under his boots. Creak. Soft. The kind of sound old houses make when strangers arrive. The room smelled of coffee gone bitter on the stove and wood smoke hanging low in the rafters. Thomas Hale shut the door behind them. The latch dropped with a dull iron click. For a moment nobody spoke. The wind pushed against the walls outside. Inside the lantern hummed softly. Isaiah removed his hat. Cold air lifted from his shoulders like breath leaving a tired horse. Mary moved toward the stove. She lifted the kettle. Metal scraped iron. Water began to whisper as it warmed. "You rode far," she said. Isaiah nodded once. "Far enough." Thomas eased into a chair beside the table. The wood creaked beneath his weight. His eyes never left Isaiah. "You remember the barn?" Thomas said. Isaiah glanced toward the window. The dark shape of the structure stood beyond the yard. Roof sagging slightly. Fence line leaning in the wind. "I remember," Isaiah said. Mary set a tin cup on the table. Steam curled upward as she poured. Warmth rose from the cup. Isaiah wrapped his fingers around it. The heat pressed into his palms. The first true warmth he had felt all day. Outside, a loose shutter struck the wall. Knock. Pause. Knock again. Mary looked toward the sound. "The storm last month loosened that hinge," she said. Thomas grunted softly. "More than the hinge." Isaiah lifted the cup. Coffee burned bitter against his tongue. He drank anyway. The room stayed quiet except for the small sounds of living. The kettle breathing on the stove. Firewood shifting in the hearth. Wind brushing the windows. Mary sat across from him. The lantern light showed the thin lines of worry around her eyes. "You didn't answer my father," she said. Isaiah lowered the cup. "What question was that?" "The oath." Thomas leaned forward slowly. Chair legs scraped the floor. "You swore if this ranch ever stood alone again," the old man said, "you'd ride back." Isaiah studied the steam rising from his coffee. It twisted slowly toward the rafters. Like smoke from a fire long gone. "Years pass," Isaiah said. "Promises don't," Thomas replied. Silence settled again. Heavy this time. Mary folded her hands together on the table. "Things changed here," she said quietly. Isaiah looked up. She held his gaze steady. "My husband died 2 winters ago." The fire in the hearth cracked. A sharp sound. Isaiah said nothing. Mary continued. "Since then the ranch hasn't had many visitors." Thomas reached for the badge resting on the table. The metal touched wood with a soft tap. "That badge brought you back," he said. "Not me." Isaiah stared at the worn brass. His reflection looked back in the curved surface. Older. Harder. The wind outside shifted suddenly. Hoofbeats echoed faintly from the distant road. 3 riders. Maybe 4. The sound carried through the night air. Thud. 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 Mary turned toward the window. Her fingers tightened on the table edge. "They ride past most nights now," she said quietly. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Counting cattle that don't belong to them." Isaiah rose slowly from the chair. The floor creaked under his boots. He moved to the window. Cold glass met his fingertips. Out in the darkness, lanterns flickered on the distant road. 3 riders passed along the ridge line. Watching. Waiting. The hoofbeats faded after a moment. But the quiet they left behind felt worse. Isaiah stepped away from the window. The room felt smaller now. Mary's voice came soft behind him. "You see why my father kept that badge?" Isaiah set his empty cup down. Tin touched wood with a dull knock. "What do they want?" Thomas answered without hesitation. "The land." "Name?" "Victor Caldwell." The fire snapped again in the hearth. Isaiah knew the name. Men like Caldwell grew rich, turning dust into deeds. Mary stood slowly. Her chair slid back with a faint scrape. "You must be tired from the road," she said. "There's a spare room." Isaiah shook his head. "Barn will do." Mary looked toward the door. Wind rattled the loose shutter again. Knock. 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 "You rode all day," she said. "And the nights are colder now." Isaiah rested a hand on the back of the chair. The wood felt warm from the fire. warmer than the wind outside. Thomas watched him carefully. "You planning to ride out tomorrow?" the old rancher asked. Isaiah didn't answer right away. The fire settled lower. Embers glowed red beneath the logs. The room held its breath. Finally Isaiah spoke. "Storm's coming." Mary frowned slightly. The sky looked clear tonight. Isaiah glanced toward the dark window. "Not that kind." Silence again. Then Mary turned toward the hallway. "Come in anyway," she said quietly. "Cold doesn't argue with stubborn men." Isaiah hesitated only a moment. Then he stepped deeper into the house. The floorboards creaked again under his boots. Behind him the wind pressed against the walls. Ahead of him the warmth of the fire stretched through the hallway. And Mary Hale closed the door against the cold night outside. Morning crept over the ranch in thin gray light. Cold clung to the fields. Frost lay across the fence rails like pale dust. Isaiah Reed stepped out of the barn and pulled his coat tight across his shoulders. The barn door groaned behind him. A horse shifted inside the stall. Leather creaked as the animal shook its head. Somewhere beyond the pasture a crow called once. Sharp. Lonely. The ranch house chimney released a narrow ribbon of smoke. Warmth rising into the cold sky. Isaiah walked toward the house. His boots struck the frozen ground with quiet crunches. Crunch. Pause. Crunch again. The porch boards answered under his weight. Creak. Inside the kitchen the stove already breathed heat. Mary Hale stood near the iron range. A skillet hissed softly where bacon touched hot metal. The smell drifted through the room. Warm. Heavy. Real. Thomas Hale sat at the table sharpening a knife. Steel scraped slowly along the whetstone. Scrape. 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 Mary glanced over her shoulder. "You sleep at all?" Isaiah nodded once. Barn was quiet. Thomas looked up. "Quiet won't last long." The knife rasped across the stone again. Isaiah stepped closer to the stove. Cold melted slowly from his fingers. Mary slid a plate onto the table. Eggs. Bacon. Thick bread browned in grease. The food landed with a soft thud against the wood. "Eat before it cools," she said. Isaiah sat. The chair creaked beneath him. For a moment the room held only small living sounds. Fork touching plate. Fire popping inside the stove. Wind brushing lightly against the windows. Warmth pushed against the cold outside. Thomas leaned back slightly. "You ever mend fence anymore, soldier?" Isaiah wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I remember how." The old rancher nodded toward the pasture. South line broke during the storm. Isaiah rose without another word. Outside the morning wind moved slower now. Sunlight crept across the fields. The barn smelled of hay and horse sweat. Isaiah lifted a coil of wire and slung it across his shoulder. Metal clinked softly. The pasture stretched wide and quiet. Fence posts leaned like tired men. He set to work. Wire pulled tight. Pliers snapped. Wood creaked as the posts straightened. The rhythm settled into his hands. Work. Simple. Honest. For a while the ranch felt almost peaceful. Mary appeared near midday carrying a small bucket. Steam curled from inside. Soup. The smell of onion and broth drifted across the field. She watched him hammer a staple into the post. Hammer struck metal. Tink. 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 "You work like a man who used to belong here," she said. Isaiah wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Work is work." Mary handed him the cup. He'd soaked through the tin. "You left without saying goodbye," she said quietly. Isaiah stared out across the land. The wind moved through the grass in slow waves. "That was a long time ago." Mary held his gaze. "My father never stopped waiting." Before Isaiah could answer, a distant sound rolled across the hills. Hoofbeats. Slow. Measured. Both of them turned toward the ridge. 3 riders appeared along the far road. Dark shapes against the pale sky. They did not approach. They only watched. One rider tipped his hat mockingly before turning away. The hoofbeats faded. Thud. Thud. Gone. Mary's hands tightened around the empty bucket. They do that most days now. Isaiah bent back toward the fence wire, looking for weakness. Mary studied him. You see any? Isaiah pulled the wire tight until it sang. A sharp metal hum. Not yet. The afternoon passed with the sound of work. Hammer strikes. Fence wire stretching. Wind moving through the grass. By sunset the south line stood straight again. Golden light spread across the pasture. Warm. Soft. Mary stood on the porch watching. Thomas leaned beside her with arms folded. Isaiah walked toward the house carrying the empty wire coil. The porch boards creaked again beneath his weight. Thomas nodded toward the repaired field. Looks like a wrench again. Isaiah set the coil beside the door. For now. Mary opened the door. Warm air spilled into the cool evening. Inside the fire already glowed bright. Logs cracked softly as they burned. Isaiah stepped into the room. His boots left small tracks of dust across the floor. Mary closed the door behind him. The latch clicked shut. Thomas poured 3 cups of coffee. Steam drifted upward in slow spirals. For a moment the ranch felt almost safe. Then a distant rifle shot echoed from somewhere across the darkening hills. One sharp crack. The 3 of them froze. Silence returned after the sound faded. Thomas set the coffee pot down slowly. They're getting closer, he said. Isaiah lifted the cup. Warmth pressed into his hands. His voice stayed calm. Then we fix more than fences tomorrow. Night settled slowly over the ranch. Cold came with it. The wind slid down from the hills and pressed against the walls of the house. Inside, the fire held the darkness back. Logs shifted in the hearth. Pop. A small burst of sparks lifted and faded. Isaiah Reed sat at the table with a strip of leather across his knee. A saddle strap. His fingers worked slow and steady with the needle. Thread pulling through thick hide. Pull. Pause. Pull again. Across the room Mary Hale folded blankets beside the stove. Warm light brushed her face. The kettle murmured softly. Steam drifted upward like pale breath. Thomas Hale rocked in the chair near the fire. The chair creaked every time it moved. Creak. Creak. The sound filled the quiet house. Mary glanced toward Isaiah. You always sew your own tack. Isaiah didn't look up. Army teaches a man to mend what breaks. Thomas grunted softly. Army teaches plenty of other things too. The needle slid through the leather again. Pull. Isaiah tied the knot and cut the thread with his knife. Silence returned. Only the fire speaking now. Mary set the blankets aside. She crossed the room and reached toward the small shelf above the mantel. Metal touched wood with a soft scrape. She lifted the tarnished Buffalo Soldier badge. The brass caught the firelight. A dull glow. Isaiah's eyes moved to it without meaning to. Mary turned the badge slowly in her fingers. You carried this a long time, she said. Isaiah leaned back in the chair. The wood creaked beneath his weight. Long enough. Mary walked closer and placed the badge on the table. It landed with a quiet click. My father said you left it here the day you rode away. Isaiah studied the mark of the buffalo stamped deep in the metal. Firelight flickered across the worn edges. Thomas spoke from the chair. You remember that winter? Isaiah nodded once. Snow piled against the barn walls. Wind screaming through broken boards. A wounded soldier lying in the Hale barn with fever burning through his bones. Mary watched his face carefully. You never told me why you left, she said. Isaiah's hand rested beside the badge. His fingers did not touch it. War was finished, he said. Men had to find somewhere else to be. Mary tilted her head slightly. That's not an answer. Thomas shifted in his chair. The fire cracked again. A small log split open with a sharp snap. Outside, wind rattled the loose shutter. Knock. Pause. Knock again. Isaiah glanced toward the sound. Mary followed his eyes. That hinge again, she said quietly. Isaiah rose from the chair. The floorboards creaked under his boots. He crossed to the window and looked out. Cold darkness pressed against the glass. The pasture lay still beneath the moon. For a moment everything looked peaceful. Then a faint orange glow moved along the distant ridge. Lantern light. Riders again. Slow. Watching. Isaiah's jaw tightened. Behind him Mary's voice came low. They circle every night now. Isaiah turned back toward the room. How many? Usually 3. Thomas pushed himself upright. The chair groaned as it rocked forward. Sometimes 4, the old rancher added. Isaiah returned to the table. He picked up the badge this time. Cold metal pressed into his palm. You tell the sheriff. Thomas gave a short laugh. Dry. No humor in it. Sheriff works for Caldwell now. The fire dimmed slightly as a log settled lower. Mary stepped closer to the table. Her shadow stretched across the floor. You knew that name earlier, she said. Isaiah set the badge down again. Click. I've heard it. Then you know what kind of man he is. Isaiah didn't answer. Silence filled the room again. Heavy. Outside the hoofbeats drifted faintly across the hills. Thud. Thud. Slow. Unhurried. Mary moved toward the door. She opened it a crack. Cold air slipped inside. The lantern by the porch swayed in the wind. The riders' shapes appeared briefly on the ridge. Watching the ranch. Waiting. Mary closed the door again. The latch dropped. Inside the house the warmth returned slowly. Thomas walked to the window. His breath fogged the glass. They're counting our days, he muttered. Isaiah leaned against the table. His fingers rested beside the badge. You still have the deed? Thomas nodded. Locked in the chest upstairs. Mary looked between them. And Caldwell keeps asking for it. The wind pressed hard against the house again. Boards groaned softly. The loose shutter struck the wall. Knock. 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 Isaiah lifted the badge once more. He turned it slowly under the lantern light. The buffalo mark stared back at him. A promise burned into brass. Mary's voice softened. You swore something that winter. Isaiah looked up at her. The firelight flickered across his face. He spoke quietly. I swore if this ranch ever stood alone. His words trailed off. Thomas watched him carefully. And now it does, the old rancher said. Outside the hoofbeats faded into the distance. Silence returned to the hills. Inside the fire burned warmer. Isaiah placed the badge back on the table. His voice came steady. Then I suppose I'll stay a little longer. Morning arrived with a hard wind. Cold swept across the pasture and rattled the fence wires. The ranch woke slowly beneath it. Isaiah Reed stepped out onto the porch. His breath drifted pale in the air. The yard lay quiet except for the horses shifting near the barn. Leather creaked. A hoof scraped dirt. Behind him the kitchen door opened. Warm air rolled out with the smell of coffee. Mary Hale stood in the doorway with a tin cup in her hand. You were up before the sun, she said. Isaiah nodded once. Fence line still holds. Mary handed him the cup. Heat soaked into his fingers. Inside the house Thomas Hale coughed near the stove. The fire snapped. Wood cracked softly. Isaiah took a slow drink. The warmth spread through his chest. For a moment the ranch felt still. Safe. Then the distant rumble came. Hoofbeats. Heavy. More than 3 this time. Mary turned toward the road. Dust lifted along the far ridge. A line of riders moved through the morning light. 5 men. Maybe 6. Isaiah set the cup down on the porch rail. The metal rang softly. Mary's voice lowered. "That's more than usual." Isaiah watched the riders descend toward the ranch gate. Their horses moved steady and slow. No hurry. Men who knew they owned the road. Thomas stepped out beside them. His old coat flapped in the wind. He squinted toward the approaching riders. "Caldwell," he muttered. The ranch gate creaked as the riders pushed it open. Wood groaned against rusted hinges. The horses entered the yard without asking. Hooves thudded against packed dirt. Dust rose around them. The lead rider sat tall in the saddle. Victor Caldwell. Black coat. Silver watch chain catching the morning light. His horse snorted once and stamped. Caldwell looked around the ranch yard like a man inspecting something he already bought. "Well now," he said calmly. "So this is the famous Hale Ranch." His voice carried smooth and easy, like oil sliding across water. Mary stepped forward onto the porch. Her hands rested tight against the railing. "This land isn't for sale." Caldwell smiled faintly. "Everything is for sale, Mrs. Hale." Isaiah remained still near the porch steps. The wind tugged lightly at the edges of his coat. Caldwell's eyes shifted toward him. The smile thinned. "And who might this be?" Thomas answered before Isaiah could speak. "Old friend." Caldwell studied Isaiah's faded cavalry coat. His gaze lingered on the brass buttons. Recognition flickered. "A soldier," Caldwell said. "Retired, I hope." Isaiah said nothing. The silence stretched between them. One of Caldwell's men laughed under his breath. Caldwell removed a folded paper from his coat. The parchment snapped in the wind. He held it up. "Legal deed transfer," he said. "Signed by the bank and the county office." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You bought a debt," the rancher said. "You didn't buy this land." Caldwell shrugged lightly. "Debt becomes land eventually." The wind pushed harder across the yard. Loose boards on the barn clattered. Clack. Clack. A cow lowed somewhere in the pasture. Uneasy. Caldwell leaned forward in the saddle. "Now I'm a patient man," he said. "But patience has limits." He nodded toward the hills behind the ranch. "Railroad surveyors arrive in spring." Mary's grip tightened on the porch rail. "You want to sell the land to them?" Caldwell tipped his hat slightly. "Very good." Thomas stepped down from the porch. His boots struck the dirt hard. "This ranch stays with the Hale family." Caldwell's smile vanished. The air cooled around him. "You misunderstand," he said softly. "This ranch stays with whoever holds the paper." He lifted the document again. Wind snapped it sharply. Isaiah watched the paper move in Caldwell's hand. Then he spoke for the first time. "You bring 6 men to deliver a letter." Caldwell turned his head slowly. His eyes narrowed. "A man learns to bring witnesses when stubborn folk live on valuable land." One of the riders shifted in his saddle. Leather creaked. A rifle rested across the man's thigh. Mary noticed it. Her breath caught quietly. Caldwell slid the paper back into his coat. "I'll return in 3 days," he said. "Perhaps you'll have reconsidered." Thomas crossed his arms. "We won't." Caldwell's gaze drifted back to Isaiah. "You'll want to leave before then, soldier." Isaiah remained still. Wind brushed across the yard. Dust moved along the ground in thin ribbons. Caldwell studied him another moment. Then he smiled again. "Cold this time?" "Well." He turned his horse. The other riders followed. Hooves churned the dirt. The ranch gate groaned open once more. Before leaving, Caldwell glanced back over his shoulder. His voice carried across the yard. 3 days. The riders disappeared up the road. The hoofbeats faded slowly into the wind. Silence returned. Only the creak of the barn door and the whistle of cold air remained. Thomas exhaled heavily. Mary stepped down from the porch. Her voice came quiet. "He means it." Isaiah picked up the empty tin cup from the rail. It felt cold now. He looked toward the distant road where the riders vanished. "Yes," he said. "He does." The wind carried the smell of dust and cattle across the pasture. Morning light spread thin and pale over the fields. Isaiah Reed walked the fence line with a rifle resting across his shoulder. Wire hummed softly where the wind touched it. The land looked peaceful from a distance. Quiet grass. Slow cattle. Open sky. But the quiet felt wrong. Too watchful. Too still. A fence post ahead leaned sideways. Isaiah crouched beside it. Fresh cuts marked the wood. Not weather. Knife work. The wire had been sliced clean. Cold air slid across the broken line. Cattle had already wandered through. Isaiah stood slowly. His jaw tightened. Boots crunched over the frost as he walked along the fence. Another break appeared 20 yards farther. Wire hanging loose. Post cracked halfway through. Sabotage done careful and quiet. A crow called from the fence rail. Sharp. Mocking. Isaiah followed the tracks leading away from the gap. Horse prints. 3 animals. Heavy riders. He studied the dirt for a long moment. Then he turned back toward the ranch house. The barn door creaked when he pushed it open. A horse lifted its head and snorted. Mary Hale stood inside near the stall. A lantern burned beside her even in daylight. Warm yellow light against the cold shadows. "You see it," she said. Isaiah nodded. They cut the south fence. Mary's hand tightened around the lantern handle. Again. Isaiah rested the rifle against the stall rail. The metal tapped wood with a dull knock. 3 riders. Mary lowered her eyes. They came after midnight. Isaiah looked at her. "You heard them?" She nodded slowly. "I heard the wire snap." The barn felt warmer than the open wind outside. But the warmth carried worry with it. A horse stamped its hoof. Dust rose from the floor. Isaiah reached for a coil of wire. "We fix it." Mary steadied his face. "You can't fix a fence every night forever." Isaiah lifted the coil onto his shoulder. "No." He walked toward the door. "But I can make it harder." Outside the sun had climbed higher. The frost melted slowly across the grass. Thomas Hale waited near the porch with a hammer resting in his belt. The old rancher looked tired. Lines cut deeper into his face. "They hit the south line," Isaiah said. Thomas spat into the dirt. "Caldwell's dogs." They walked together toward the pasture. Boots crunching over gravel. Wind pushing at their coats. The broken fence sagged like a tired rope. Isaiah knelt and began pulling wire tight. Thomas drove new staples into the post. Hammer strikes echoed across the field. Tink. 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 For a moment the work drowned out everything else. Noise against silence. Effort against cold. Then the sound came. Hoofbeats again. Slow. Unhurried. Both men straightened. 3 riders waited on the distant hill. Watching. The same 3 from yesterday. Sunlight flashed along a rifle barrel. Mary stepped onto the porch behind them. Her voice carried faintly. "They're back." Isaiah finished twisting the wire. He pulled it tight until the metal sang. A sharp note in the wind. Then he stood. The riders did not move. They simply watched the work continue. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow. "They want us tired." Isaiah nodded. "They want the land empty." The riders lingered another moment. Then one lifted his rifle. The shot cracked across the pasture. A cow bellowed loudly and collapsed in the grass. The sound echoed against the hills. Mary gasped from the porch. The riders turned their horses and rode away without another word. Dust trailed behind them. Silence returned slowly. Thomas walked toward the fallen animal. His boots moved slower now. He knelt beside the cow. Blood darkened the grass. The wind carried the smell sharp and metallic. Thomas removed his hat. "They're not even hiding it now," he said quietly. Isaiah stood beside him. His hands hung still at his sides. "They're sending a message." Thomas looked up. "What kind?" Isaiah watched the road where the riders disappeared. "The kind that says the next shot won't be cattle." The ranch felt colder after that. Mary wrapped a blanket around her shoulders when they returned to the house. The stove glowed bright with fire. Wood popped loudly in the heat. Inside, the warmth struggled against the chill pressing through the walls. Thomas poured coffee into 3 cups. His hands trembled slightly. Mary sat beside the window. Her eyes followed every shadow outside. Isaiah remained standing near the door. The rifle leaned against the wall beside him. He lifted the cup slowly. Steam rose into the air. Warm. Fading. Mary spoke softly. 2 days until Caldwell returns." Thomas stared into his coffee. "And fewer cows now." The wind rattled the loose shutter again. Knock. 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 Isaiah set the cup down. His voice came quiet but steady. "They're trying to scare you out before he rides back." Mary lifted her eyes toward him. "And if we don't leave?" Isaiah looked at the rifle by the door. Then back toward the cold fields outside. "Then he'll try something worse." Dawn came slow and gray over the ranch. Cold wind slid through the grass and rattled the loose shutter beside the house. Knock. Pause. Knock again. Isaiah Reed stood on the porch watching the road. His coat hung heavy on his shoulders. The rifle rested across his arms. The ranch yard looked quiet. Too quiet. No cattle moving near the fence. No riders on the hills. Even the crows stayed silent. Behind him the kitchen door creaked open. Mary Hale stepped onto the porch carrying a tin cup. Steam curled from the rim. "You haven't slept," she said. Isaiah did not turn. "Enough." Mary placed the cup on the railing beside him. The metal clicked softly. "Today is the 3rd day." Isaiah nodded once. Wind pushed harder across the yard. Dust lifted in thin ribbons. Mary folded her arms against the cold. "You think Caldwell comes himself?" Isaiah watched the road. "Yes." Thomas Hale opened the door behind them. Bootsteps crossed the porch boards. Creak. Creak. The old rancher stood beside Isaiah and looked toward the empty road. His face carried the tight patience of a man waiting for a storm. "He'll bring men," Thomas said. Isaiah's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Yes." For a long moment nothing moved. The wind whispered through the grass. The barn door groaned softly in its hinges. Then the sound came. Hoofbeats. Many of them. Slow. Heavy. Mary stiffened. Dust rose on the far road like smoke. Shapes appeared inside it. Riders. 6. No. 7. Victor Caldwell rode at the front. His black coat snapped lightly in the wind. The men behind him carried rifles across their saddles. The ranch gate creaked when they pushed it open. Wood rasped against rusted hinges. The horses entered the yard without slowing. Hooves struck the dirt in dull thuds. Dust swirled around their legs. Caldwell stopped his horse near the porch. He studied the house calmly. His voice carried smooth through the cold air. "Morning, Mrs. Hale." Mary stood straight against the railing. Her hands gripped the wood tight. "Leave this land." Caldwell smiled faintly. "I offered patience." He glanced toward Thomas. "You offered stubbornness." Thomas stepped forward onto the porch edge. "This ranch stays with my family." Caldwell removed a folded document from his coat. Paper snapped in the wind. The sound cut sharp through the yard. "You had 3 days." He held the paper toward Mary. All you need to do is sign." Mary did not move. The wind tugged at her hair. "I won't." Caldwell's smile faded slowly. The yard grew quiet again. Even the wind seemed to pause. One of Caldwell's men shifted in the saddle. Leather creaked. A rifle barrel caught the light. Isaiah stepped down from the porch. His boots struck the dirt with slow certainty. Dust rose around his feet. Caldwell watched him approach. "You're still here, soldier." Isaiah stopped several paces from the horse. The rifle rested loosely in his hand. Caldwell tilted his head slightly. "I warned you about standing in the way of business." Isaiah's voice stayed calm. "You call this business?" Caldwell gestured lightly toward the ranch house. "Land changes hands every day." Isaiah glanced at the riders behind him. 7 men. 7 rifles. The wind brushed across the yard again. Cold against his face. Thomas spoke from the porch. "You won't scare us out." Caldwell turned his horse slightly. Hooves scraped the dirt. "I'm not here to scare you." His voice dropped. "I'm here to end the conversation." One of the riders lifted his rifle and aimed toward the barn. The shot cracked across the yard. Wood splintered from the barn wall. The echo rolled through the fields. Mary flinched. Thomas's hand tightened around the porch rail. Isaiah did not move. Caldwell watched him closely. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Sign the deed." Mary stepped down beside Isaiah. Her voice shook but did not break. "This land buried my husband." Caldwell's eyes hardened. "That's unfortunate." The riders behind him shifted again. Another rifle lifted slightly. The barn door creaked in the wind. Knock. 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 The sound felt loud now. Isaiah looked slowly at each man in the saddle. Counting. Measuring. Then he turned back toward Caldwell. "You ride away now," Isaiah said quietly. Caldwell laughed once. Short. Cold. "You think one old soldier changes anything here?" Isaiah's grip tightened on the rifle. The wind moved across the yard again. Dust swirling between boots and hooves. "No," Isaiah said. "I think 7 men made a mistake riding into this yard." Silence fell hard across the ranch. Even Caldwell stopped smiling. The air felt heavy. Waiting. Then Caldwell leaned forward in his saddle. His voice carried soft but sharp. "You'll regret that answer." The riders shifted their rifles. Hooves stamped the ground. And the ranch yard suddenly felt like the center of a coming storm. Wind slid across the ranch yard. Cold. Dry. Dust drifted between boots and hooves. 7 riders waited in the open space before the house. Rifles resting easy. Men confident in numbers. Isaiah Reed stood alone in the yard. His rifle hung low in his hands. Mary Hale stood behind him on the porch. Thomas beside her. The barn door creaked in the wind. Knock. 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 Victor Caldwell watched Isaiah the way a man studies an animal he plans to break. "You're standing in the wrong place, soldier," Caldwell said. His horse stamped once. Leather creaked. Isaiah didn't move. "This is exactly the place." Silence stretched across the yard. One of Caldwell's riders shifted his rifle. The metal clicked against the saddle horn. Caldwell's gaze flicked briefly toward Mary. Then back to Isaiah. "You think courage stops a bullet?" Isaiah's voice stayed quiet. "No." Wind moved through the grass. Cold brushed across the porch boards. Isaiah lifted his chin slightly. "But truth sometimes stops a thief." Caldwell frowned. "What truth?" Isaiah reached slowly into his coat. Several rifles lifted instantly. Wood stocks creaked. Metal scraped leather. Mary's breath caught behind him. Isaiah pulled something small from his coat pocket. Brass flashed dull in the morning light. The Buffalo Soldier badge. It clicked softly as he placed it in his palm. Caldwell studied it with mild annoyance. "I don't care about old army trinkets." Isaiah looked up. "This badge carries more weight than your paper." Caldwell laughed. "My paper carries the law." Isaiah shook his head once. "You bought a debt." He turned toward Thomas. "Show him." Thomas hesitated. The wind pressed against the porch. Mary touched her father's sleeve. Thomas nodded slowly and stepped inside the house. The riders watched carefully. One of them shifted his horse sideways. The saddle leather groaned. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "You're stalling." Isaiah didn't answer. The ranch yard felt colder now. Wind scraping along the boards of the house. Seconds stretched. Then the door opened again. Thomas stepped out holding a wooden box. Old oak. Iron corners dark with age. He carried it slowly to the porch railing. The lid creaked when he opened it. Inside rested a stack of folded papers. Caldwell leaned forward in his saddle. His smile returned. "Ah. The deed." Thomas shook his head. "Something older." He pulled out a single document. The paper yellow with years. Edges worn thin. Thomas handed it to Isaiah. Isaiah unfolded it carefully. The wind tugged at the corners. "This," Isaiah said calmly, "is a protection charter filed by the cavalry in 1872. Caldwell's smile faded slightly. Isaiah held the paper where the riders could see. The Hale Ranch was placed under federal protection after aiding a Buffalo Soldier company during a winter campaign. Thomas nodded beside him. "Saved half the troop from freezing." Isaiah continued. "That protection states the Hale family land cannot be seized through debt or auction without federal review." The riders shifted uneasily. One of them muttered under his breath. Caldwell's face hardened. "That document means nothing now." Isaiah met his eyes. "It means the moment you touch the deed, you commit federal theft." The wind whipped harder across the yard. Dust curled around the horse's legs. Caldwell stared at the paper for a long moment. The calm mask slipped slightly. Behind him one of the riders lowered his rifle. Another shifted uncertainly. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "You expect me to believe an old cavalry scrap outweighs a bank contract?" Isaiah folded the paper slowly. The sound of the creasing parchment carried clearly through the silence. "I expect you to understand what happens when a Buffalo Soldier carries proof to the nearest fort." Caldwell's eyes flashed. "Anger now?" "Real." "You're bluffing." Isaiah looked toward the horizon. "Am I?" The wind rattled the loose shutter again. Knock. 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 For several seconds nobody moved. Then Caldwell straightened in his saddle. The calculation returned to his eyes. Cold. Sharp. He glanced at the uneasy men behind him. Then back at Isaiah. "You're clever," Caldwell said quietly. "But paper doesn't stop bullets." He lifted his hand slightly. The riders raised their rifles again. Wood stocks sliding into shoulders. Mary gasped softly on the porch. Thomas stepped in front of her. Isaiah moved before anyone else. His rifle came up smooth. The shot cracked across the yard. One rider's rifle spun from his hands as the bullet struck the barrel. Metal rang loudly. The horse beneath him reared. Chaos broke loose. Another rider fired. The shot slammed into the porch railing. Wood exploded into splinters beside Mary. Isaiah fired again. Another rifle dropped from its owner's hands. Men shouted. Horses bucked and turned. Dust surged across the yard. Two riders wheeled away instantly. Another struggled to control his panicked horse. Isaiah's voice cut through the noise. "Ride away." His rifle remained steady. Caldwell stared at the confusion around him. The easy victory had vanished. His riders looked shaken now. Uncertain. The Buffalo Soldier stood unmoving in the yard. Cold wind snapping his coat. Caldwell pulled his horse around sharply. "This isn't finished," he snapped. Isaiah didn't lower the rifle. No. Caldwell glared once more. Then he kicked his horse hard. The riders followed in scattered motion. Hooves thundered through the gate. Dust swallowed them as they disappeared up the road. Silence returned slowly. Only the wind remained. And the soft creak of the barn door swinging in the cold air. Dust settled slowly across the ranch yard. The wind moved softer now. Cold still lingered in the air, but the storm of hooves had passed. Isaiah Reed lowered his rifle. The barrel still smoked faintly. Behind him the porch boards creaked. Mary Hale stepped down carefully. Thomas followed a moment later. The broken railing hung crooked where the bullet struck. Wood splinters littered the steps. Mary looked toward the road where Caldwell disappeared. They're gone. Isaiah nodded. For now. The barn door tapped lightly in the breeze. Knock. Pause. Knock again. The sound seemed quieter now. Thomas removed his hat and rubbed a hand across his face. His fingers trembled slightly. You ran them off. Isaiah glanced down at the rifle in his hands. They ran themselves. Mary stepped into the yard beside him. Her eyes studied the fading dust trail. You knew they would. Isaiah didn't answer. The wind moved through the pasture grass in slow waves. Cattle stirred again in the distance. Life returning to the quiet land. Thomas turned toward the house. We should get inside. The kitchen felt warmer than before. The stove glowed bright with fresh wood. Flames flickered through the iron door. Mary set a kettle onto the burner. Water began to whisper as it warmed. Isaiah leaned his rifle against the wall. The metal tapped wood with a dull knock. For a moment the three of them stood without speaking. Only the fire and kettle filled the room. Warmth against the cold outside. Mary poured coffee into 3 cups. Steam curled upward. She handed one to Isaiah. Their fingers brushed briefly. Her voice came softer now. You could have left. Isaiah took the cup. Heat soaked slowly into his hands. Yes. Thomas sat heavily at the table. The chair groaned beneath him. But you stayed. Isaiah studied the steam rising from the coffee. It was time. Mary looked at him carefully. The oath. Isaiah nodded once. The oath. Thomas leaned forward. That paper you showed Caldwell. Isaiah reached into his coat. The folded document appeared again. He set it gently on the table. The parchment made a soft dry sound against the wood. Mary traced the edge with her fingertips. You never told me the full story, she said. Isaiah rested his hands beside the paper. The fire popped behind him. A sharp crack in the quiet room. It was winter, he said. 20 years ago. The wind outside brushed along the house walls. Inside the room stayed warm. Snow came early that year, Isaiah continued. Our patrol got lost in the canyon north of here. Thomas nodded slowly. I remember the storm. Isaiah's eyes stayed on the fire. Half the men froze before morning. Silence filled the kitchen. Mary's hand tightened slightly around her cup. We were finished, Isaiah said quietly. Cold took our horses. Food ran out. Men stopped talking. Thomas leaned closer. And then. Isaiah looked at him. You found us. The old rancher's eyes softened. You were barely breathing when we dragged you into the barn. Isaiah nodded. You and your wife kept the fire burning 3 days. Mary looked between them. My mother. Thomas gave a quiet smile. She made soup until every soldier could stand again. The kettle began to rattle softly on the stove. Warm steam rising into the rafters. Isaiah tapped the document lightly with one finger. The captain wrote that charter before we rode out. Mary read the faded lines slowly. The Hale Ranch protected by federal cavalry authority. Her voice trembled slightly. So the land could never be taken. Isaiah nodded. A debt repaid. Thomas leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked gently. I told you that winter meant something. Isaiah reached into his pocket again. The Buffalo Soldier badge appeared once more. The brass glowed dull in the firelight. He placed it beside the charter. Click. I left it here as a promise. Mary looked at the badge. You never expected to come back. Isaiah shook his head. No. The wind tapped the loose shutter outside. Knock. Knock. The sound felt distant now. Mary folded the paper carefully and slid it back across the table. Her eyes held his. You kept the oath anyway. Isaiah lifted the badge again. Cold metal pressed against his palm. I almost didn't. Thomas studied him quietly. What changed? Isaiah looked toward the window. Evening light stretched across the pasture. Golden and calm. Your father's hand on my stirrup, he said. Mary smiled faintly. He never lets go of anything important. Outside, a cow lowed softly in the field. The ranch breathed again. Life returning to the land. Isaiah set the badge beside the stove. The metal warmed slowly in the firelight. Mary's voice came gentle. You don't have to ride away this time. Isaiah looked at her. The warmth in the room pushed against the old cold in his chest. For the first time in many years, the soldier did not feel like a man passing through. He felt like someone who had finally found the road back. Spring arrived slowly across the Hale ranch. The last snowmelt ran in quiet ribbons through the pasture. Water trickled along the fence line. Soft. Steady. Warm sunlight spread across the fields where frost once clung. Isaiah leaned against the porch rail and watched the cattle move through fresh grass. The herd sounded different now. Low calls. Hooves pressing softly into thawed earth. Life returning to the land. Behind him the kitchen door opened. Mary Hale stepped onto the porch with 2 tin cups. Steam drifted upward. Coffee strong and dark. She handed one to Isaiah. The metal felt warm in his hands. You're up before the cattle again, she said. Isaiah glanced across the pasture. Old habit still holding. Someone has to keep an eye on things. Mary leaned beside him. The porch boards creaked under their weight. Sunlight warmed the wood. Thomas Hale's voice drifted from the barn. Sharp and irritated. A hammer struck metal. Clang. Pause. Clang again. Mary smiled faintly. Father's been fighting that hinge all morning. Isaiah took a slow drink. Coffee bitter. Comforting. I told him I'd fix it. Mary shook her head. He won't let you. The hammer struck again. Clang. Then Thomas appeared from the barn, wiping grease from his hands. The wind moved gently across the yard now. Not the cold wind of winter. Something softer. Thomas walked toward the porch. You two enjoying the morning while I do the work. Isaiah set the cup down. I'll take the hinge. Thomas waved him off. Already done. The barn door swung open behind him. Smooth. Quiet. No creak. The old rancher looked proud of that. Mary laughed softly. Miracles happen. For a moment the ranch rested in peaceful silence. Birds moved through the cottonwood tree beside the house. Leaves whispered in the breeze. The pasture stretched wide and green. Thomas leaned against the porch rail. You think Caldwell stays gone? The question carried a small shadow. Isaiah looked toward the distant road. Empty. Dustless. He knows the charter is real. Thomas grunted. Men like him don't give up easy. Isaiah nodded once. They don't. The wind stirred again through the grass. Warm this time. Not threatening. Mary folded her arms against the rail. If he tries again. Isaiah looked at the ranch. The barn standing straight. Fence lines holding firm. Smoke rising from the house chimney. Then he finds the same answer. Thomas studied him. And that answer is. Isaiah rested his hands on the rail. This land isn't alone anymore. Silence returned gently. The kind that belongs to safe places. A wagon rattled faintly somewhere down the road. Distant. Harmless. Mary stepped inside the house for a moment. When she returned, she carried something small. The Buffalo Soldier badge. The brass had been cleaned. The buffalo mark shone brighter now. She held it toward Isaiah. "I thought it shouldn't stay in a pocket anymore." Thomas nodded slowly. "Too many years hiding." Isaiah turned the badge in his hand. Sunlight caught along the edges. The metal glowed warm instead of dull. Mary pointed toward the doorframe beside the porch. A small iron hook waited there. Isaiah stepped forward. The wood of the doorway felt warm under his fingers. He hung the badge on the hook. The metal tapped softly against the wood. Click. The sound carried clear in the quiet yard. The same badge that once marked an old promise. Now resting where everyone could see it. The breeze moved gently through the porch. The badge swung slightly. Click. Click. A soft sound. Peaceful. Mary looked at it for a long moment. "That feels right." Thomas leaned back against the rail. "Like the ranch remembers something." Isaiah watched the badge sway in the sunlight. The wind nudged it again. Click. Click. A calm rhythm. Not a warning. Not a summons to war. Just a quiet reminder. Out in the pasture the cattle moved slowly through the grass. Birds called from the cottonwoods. The ranch breathed easy beneath the warm sky. Mary stood beside Isaiah. Her voice came low. "You staying a while?" Isaiah looked across the land one more time. Fields bright with spring. Barn doors open. Fence lines strong. The kind of place a man might finally rest. He nodded once. For a good while. The breeze touched the porch again. The badge swung lightly on its hook. Click. Click. And the old oath sounded different now. Not heavy. Not haunted. Just the quiet sound of a promise kept. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.